It was a Thursday morning when they knocked gray skies, the kind that sit low, like a ceiling about to fall. I was in my shed oiling the hinges on my back gate when I heard the sharp rehearsed knock of someone who didn't care whether they were welcome or not. 3 raps, pause. Then again. I dried my hands with a rag, wiped the oil on my jeans, and stepped out to the front of the property. They stood side by side like they rehearsed that too. Melissa Denton, the HOA vice president, wearing that powder blue blazer like she was running for mayor, and behind her, Don Walters, their so-called compliance officer, a clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield. I knew both their names before they opened their mouths. They'd made a reputation for themselves since the last board election, swinging fines, like hammers, patrolling like the neighborhood was a military base. Melissa smiled, tight-lipped, and practiced. "Mr. Callahan," she said like she was chewing gravel, "we need to speak with you about an unauthorized alteration on your property." I raised an eyebrow. "You'll have to be more specific." "I altered a lot of things this year. Built a new chicken coop. Put up a trellis for the roses. Painted the mailbox. Which alteration offended you most?" Don didn't laugh. He just clicked his pen and pointed the clipboard at the back field where my pond shimmered in the morning light just beyond the tree line. "That," he said, "the water feature. That is not permitted under community regulations without prior review and board approval." I looked past them to the pond, its still surface reflecting the low-hanging clouds. A heron stood near the edge, silent, dignified, perfectly still. I dug that pond myself over 3 weeks, not just because I had the time, but because I needed the ritual. After Margaret passed, the land felt too silent. I needed the sound of water, the hum of frogs in the dusk, the feel of doing something meaningful with my hands. "It's not a water feature," I said finally. "It's a farm pond for irrigation, soil retention, wildlife habitat. State certified." I followed the agricultural zoning code. Melissa pulled a folded paper from her purse, handed it to me with a forced civility. "Regardless of your interpretation, the HOA bylaws are clear. Any modifications involving excavation, water diversion, or visible change to the landscape must be reviewed by the Architectural Control Committee. You did not submit an application." I unfolded the paper, a fine $2,500. It was printed on HOA letterhead, complete with the seal and Melissa's signature. There was a note at the bottom that said further non-compliance would result in compounded penalties and possible legal action. "Let me get this straight," I said, staring her in the eye. "You're fining me for digging a legal farm pond on my own land." Don puffed up like a peacock. "The HOA governs appearance and environmental impact, and this pond may affect drainage patterns. The board has received anonymous concerns from other residents." "Anonymous concerns," I repeated flat. "Right." They didn't stay long after that. Melissa told me I had 10 days to remit payment or file an appeal. Don handed me a second copy of the fine, just in case I dropped the first one. Then they walked back down my gravel drive, shoulders, square heads high. I watched until they disappeared around the bend, then turned back to the shed and sat on the workbench. The fine lay in my hand like a joke no one laughed at. Margaret and I had moved to Cedar Hollow 12 years ago after I retired from the Corps. She loved the greenbelt, the walking trails, the rows of maples that turned fire red in fall. I didn't much care for the HOA even then, but she made it feel worth it. After she was gone, I stayed, because I still felt her in the land, in the old garden beds she planted, in the wind chimes she hung under the eaves, in the way the birds returned each spring without fail. But that morning, staring at the fine, I felt the line cross. I wasn't some city transplant playing farm. I knew how to read zoning maps. I'd filed the notice of intent with the county, had copies of the agricultural exemption on file. My pond was legal, inspected, and self-contained. This wasn't about runoff or aesthetics. This was about control. And I wasn't about to hand them mine. I pulled out the old file box from under the workbench, dusty, dented, full of permits and property documents. The kind of paperwork most folks never look at once the ink dries. But I wasn't most folks. I'd been a logistics officer for 23 years. I knew how to track, document, and prove a point. The pond wasn't the problem. The HOA was. And they'd just opened a gate they couldn't close. The truth is, the pond wasn't just a body of water. It was a promise I made. After Margaret died, I couldn't sleep in our bed for 3 months. I took to sitting on the back porch with a blanket watching the stars rise and fall, listening to the crickets and the wind whistle through the trees. I didn't know what healing looked like, but I knew silence was part of it. And I knew Margaret would have wanted me to keep building, keep tending. She used to say nature doesn't quit, neither should you. The idea for the pond started with a leak in the irrigation line way out near the tree line, where the soil dips naturally. I noticed water collecting after a big rain, pooling and staying for days. Frogs came, so did dragonflies. It reminded me of the ponds back in Alabama, where I grew up, the ones we'd fish from as kids, the ones that seemed to know your name. So I went to the county office, pulled zoning records, checked with agricultural extension services. Cedar Hollow wasn't a city neighborhood, it was on unincorporated land under a hybrid jurisdiction, meaning I had the right to do small-scale agricultural work. The HOA had architectural control, yes, but only for cosmetic structures, fencing additions, and so on. They didn't have jurisdiction over soil conservation efforts or farm use features. I followed protocol to a T, not because I feared them, but because I'd spent my life teaching Marines that structure was what separated order from chaos. I filed a notice of agricultural intent with the county, notified the Department of Water Resources. I even submitted my runoff plan in case they wanted to audit the impact on groundwater flow. Everything was sealed, certified, dated. But none of that mattered to Melissa Denton. She was the type who believed authority lived in the clipboard and not the Constitution. I'd watched her bulldoze garden beds, demand homeowners repaint their shutters, and threaten people for hanging wind chimes that didn't match the aesthetic. Don Walters followed behind her like a shadow with a badge. But the real engine behind the HOA wasn't power. It was fear. Most of the neighbors were retirees, single moms, or working folks too tired to challenge fines or policies. That fear kept them compliant. But it didn't work on me. That Saturday, I drove into town with a folder under my arm. It was packed with every permit email, soil analysis, water retention estimate, and map I could find. I walked into the county zoning department like it was a second deployment, shoulders back, jaw tight. The receptionist, a kid barely out of college, blinked at me when I asked for Ryan Dorsey, the environmental use coordinator. You have an appointment? No. But I have a file with 3 state-sealed permits, and I've been fined for legal water conservation. That got his attention. He disappeared down the hall and returned with a man in his 50s, tweed coat, coffee-stained mug in hand, and a face that had seen more complaints than praise. I introduced myself and laid the folder on his desk. Told him exactly what happened. Showed him the HOA letter. Then I stepped back and let the silence do the work. He flipped through the documents, slowly nodding every few pages. You filed a no-I through our office. Yes. And this runoff impact plan matches the one you submitted. It does. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. They fined you $2,500 for this pond. That's right. He rubbed his chin. You know we've had complaints about Cedar Hollow before. They've tried to regulate what they have no jurisdiction over. It's murky. But if what you're saying checks out, they're over the line. Way over, I said. And if they did it to me, they've probably done it to others. He looked at me differently after that. The following Monday, he sent out a field technician to confirm the location, drainage impact, and documentation. Everything matched. No contamination risk, no unauthorized water diversion, just a 30 by 18-foot pond, less than 3 feet deep, sitting peacefully on private land. I didn't hear anything from the HOA that week. But I noticed Don Walters' car pass by 3 times a day. Melissa stopped to take pictures from the corner, pretending to be on her phone. On Wednesday, I got a second letter, this one more aggressive. Failure to comply with payment will result in lien proceedings, it said. I pinned it to my fridge with a magnet shaped like a trout and kept my silence. That weekend, I went to the HOA meeting. Most people don't attend those anymore. They're held in the clubhouse's back room, which smells like dust and forced politeness. But I walked in wearing a clean button-up and holding a sealed manila envelope. Melissa's face twitched when she saw me. You're not on the agenda, she said from behind the folding table. I'm invoking the public comment period. She glanced at Don, then nodded. You have 3 minutes. I stepped forward and placed the envelope on the table. In that folder I began as evidence that the fine you issued me is not only unauthorized, but illegal under county law. My pond is fully permitted. I have been cleared by the Department of Water Resources. The zoning department has already reviewed the case. If you proceed with any further financial threats, I will file a formal grievance with the County Board of Commissioners and bring legal representation. The room was dead silent. You have exceeded your authority. I'm not the only one. I know of at least 3 other neighbors who were fined for planting vegetables or altering their yards without any legitimate basis. This ends now. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. Do I make myself clear? No one stopped me when I walked out. And from that day forward, something in the neighborhood shifted just a little. The wind blew different. People waved more. And I knew deep down the real storm hadn't even started yet. 3 days after the HOA meeting, I received what can only be described as a declaration of war. It came in a certified envelope, the kind they use when they want to remind you that this isn't a game. On the front, in bold red letters, were the words, "Final notice before legal action." Inside was a full-page letter written in that smug, sanitized legalese that tries to sound official, but ends up sounding cowardly. It claimed I had willfully violated HOA ordinances, disturbed the visual harmony of the neighborhood, and endangered subsurface water balance, a phrase I later confirmed they made up. At the bottom, it threatened to place a lien on my property if I did not pay the fine within 10 business days. There was no mention of the county's environmental clearance, no mention of the meeting, just a raw threat wrapped in pretense. I stood in the kitchen, the morning sun hitting the floor in long, clean slats, holding that letter in one hand and a match in the other. It wasn't defiance, it was ceremony. I stepped out to the fire pit, near the pond, knelt down, and lit a flame beneath the corner. The paper curled brown, then burst into a slow orange glow, twisting into ash like a lie unraveling. I watched it burn to nothing. This wasn't about the pond. This was about control. And the thing about control is that once you give someone an inch of it, they believe they own the mile. I didn't tell anyone I burned the letter. But I did something else that morning. I printed out copies of every communication I had with the HOA. Emails, memos, notices from the county proving the pond's legality. I compiled it all into a binder labeled Cedar Hollow, Violations of Authority. Then I called 3 neighbors. The first was Linda Mayers, a widow in her 70s, who'd been fined $800 the year prior for installing a raised vegetable bed in her backyard. The HOA had cited it as an unsightly structure visible from the road, though her backyard wasn't visible from any angle unless you climbed a tree. The second was Ramon Vega, a young father who'd been warned about painting his porch a shade of off-white that apparently didn't match the neighborhood palette. The third was Gail Rivers, a retired teacher fined for putting up solar panels despite a state law that specifically protected her right to do so. I invited them over that afternoon. We sat on my back porch overlooking the pond, the air warm and heavy with the smell of pine and water and something else possibility. I laid out their violation letters beside my binder and told them what I'd learned. Told them what the county said, what the laws really were, what the HOA couldn't legally do. Linda leaned forward, her brow creased. "You're telling me they took nearly $1,000 from me illegally?" I nodded, and probably hundreds more from others. Ramon swore softly in Spanish, under his breath, shaking his head. Gail just stared at the papers in silence. "Why haven't we done something?" Gail finally asked. "Because we thought we couldn't," I said. "We thought they were the law." "But they're not. And it's time someone showed them that." That week, the 4 of us went door to door, politely, quietly. We spoke to neighbors who had been fined, harassed, cited. We found 12 more who had stories like ours. Some small, like a $100 fine for using the wrong mailbox. Others devastating, like the couple who had to postpone retirement because they were forced to pay $6,000 in cumulative violations for unapproved landscaping that had already existed before they bought the house. I created a spreadsheet: names, dates, violations, fine amounts. I matched those against the HOA's own bylaws, which I read line by line, like scripture. Nearly 80% of the fines had no legal backing. Some were made up. Others were based on outdated clauses that had been voided when county zoning was updated. Meanwhile, Melissa and Don kept acting like nothing was happening. They sent out the monthly newsletter, hosted a summer movie night in the park, and scheduled the next compliance inspection blitz for early July. But they had no idea what was coming. I filed a formal grievance with the county's Housing and Neighborhood Affairs Department. Attached to it were 56 pages of evidence, testimony, and documentation. I didn't CC the HOA. I didn't warn them. I let the truth arrive unannounced, just like they had at my door. A week later, I got a call from Ryan Dorsey at the zoning office. "They've opened an internal review," he said, "and just so you know, your file triggered interest from the HOA Legal Oversight Unit. They're bringing in external counsel. HOA financial practices might be under audit soon." I didn't say anything at first. Just sat there in my truck, parked outside the feed store, staring at the blue sky like it held some secret I wasn't meant to hear yet. "Is that good or bad?" I finally asked. He chuckled. "Depends on where you're standing. From your side, it's about damn time." I hung up and sat there a while longer. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Don just walked by my house and didn't look up. First time in a year." The wind shifted slightly, and I swear I heard the frogs at the pond begin to sing again. The HOA had poked a sleeping bear, and now the whole forest was beginning to stir. In war, there's a saying we used to have in the Corps: know your terrain before you cross it. That's what strategy was, knowing the ground, the layout, the history beneath your feet. And what I was standing on now wasn't just soil. It was a battlefield. I'd seen enough to know that the pond was just the shallow end. What lay deeper was far murkier, a pattern of abuse, coercion, and a power structure built on silence. That week, I started digging not in the dirt, but through public records. Cedar Hollow's HOA had been incorporated back in 2003 as a nonprofit residential association. On paper, it looked reasonable. Officers elected every 3 years. Annual budget published. Community enhancement projects listed as priorities. But there was a footnote I almost missed: an amendment passed in 2014, which expanded the HOA's ability to collect environmental compliance fees with discretionary authority. That little line had been the open door Melissa Denton needed to turn policy into profit. According to financial disclosures, documents that should have been mailed to every resident annually, but never were, the HOA collected over $180,000 in fees and fines over the last 3 years. Of that, nearly 60% was unaccounted for in terms of itemized spending. I compared those numbers to what the bylaws required. No audit trail, no third-party accounting firm, just miscellaneous administrative costs. They'd turned our neighborhood into a piggy bank. I spent hours on my porch with Gail Ramone and Linda sorting through paperwork like it was evidence from a crime scene. And in a way it was. A slow, quiet theft carried out in daylight under the guise of maintaining community standards. We started reaching out to other neighbors with more than just stories. We asked for receipts, letters, emails. We created a Google Drive, organized folders, linked case numbers to specific board meetings. One neighbor, Chuck Wallace, came forward with a bombshell. He'd been on the HOA board before Melissa took over as president. He said the old board had rejected the 2014 amendment because it was too vague. But Melissa pushed it through the following year with a proxy vote campaign that confused most residents into signing over their ballots. She's smart, Chuck told us. Manipulative, but smart. She used legal gray zones to consolidate control. People thought she was just enthusiastic. They didn't realize she was rewriting the rule book. I asked him to put that in writing. He did, signed and notarized. Meanwhile, the HOA started getting nervous. That next weekend, I got a letter, not certified this time, but hand-delivered and folded twice to fit neatly into my mailbox. No return address, just typed words in venom. "We know what you're doing. If you don't stop stirring up trouble, things could get very uncomfortable for you. There are consequences to disobedience." I read it 3 times. I wasn't shaken, I was furious. I scanned the letter, emailed it to Ryan Dorsey and the Legal Oversight Unit. Then I walked back inside, printed 24 copies, and stapled them to a bulletin board I built myself 12 feet wide, posted right next to the HOA's official announcement board in the park. At the top, in large black letters, I wrote, "This is what power looks like when it's threatened." Below that, the letter. Beside it, a printout of the HOA's collected fines year by year. And beneath that, a message. You have a right to question authority. You have a right to know where your money goes. You have a right to stand on your own land without fear. By noon that Saturday, a crowd of at least 30 people had gathered around the board. Some took pictures. Others just stood in silence. By Monday, the HOA tore it down. They posted a notice that it violated unauthorized signage policies. But it was too late. The story was out. The tension had gone from a simmer to a rolling boil. And somewhere in the middle of it all, neighbors who had never spoken more than a nod at the mailbox were suddenly talking like allies. I started getting thank you notes, one from a single mother on the east side who'd been fined $400 for installing a low-cost ramp for her disabled son without architectural approval. Another from a Vietnam veteran who'd been told his flagpole disrupted visual lines of uniformity. And another, this one from a man I didn't know, who wrote simply, "My wife cried when we got that lien notice. You gave us hope again. Thank you." I kept them in a shoebox on my mantle. I didn't read them to feel proud. I read them to remember what I was fighting for. Because this wasn't about a pond anymore. It never had been. It was about people being shamed and silenced on the land they worked for. It was about a small group of bureaucrats pretending they owned the sky just because they could fine you for painting your porch. I wasn't just digging into records now. I was digging into the roots of something that had gone unchecked for far too long. And if there's one thing I learned after a lifetime of deployments, it's this. The deeper you dig into something rotten, the more likely it is to collapse. By the time the county's legal oversight unit scheduled a preliminary review of Cedar Hollow's HOA practices, word had already spread like a grass fire through the neighborhood. You could feel it on the sidewalks, in the way people lingered just a little longer at the end of their driveways, sharing quiet conversations that always ended with a glance toward the HOA office on Elm Ridge. Suspicion had taken root, and what used to be private grumbling had turned into something louder, heavier, shared indignation. It wasn't about one pond anymore. It was about all of them, all of us who had swallowed injustice because we thought we had no choice. But injustice always leaves a paper trail, and I was good at following them. Gail and I dug through public notices and old newsletters archived online. It turned out that over the last 5 years, the HOA board had passed more than a dozen policy revisions, often by quiet mail-in votes, some with as little as 13% of the community participating. The language was deliberately vague phrases like environmental harmony, neighborhood standards, and visual congruity. None of it had teeth. But Melissa and her board had sharpened it into weapons. I cross-referenced those policies with the fines collected from residents. What I found sickened me. Some people had been fined twice in the same month for the same issue, just under different descriptions. One resident, a young couple, with a toddler, had paid nearly $2,800 in 3 years over issues like excess lawn growth, improper trash bin alignment, and once for noise disturbance because their child cried during the night. But what cut deepest was this: the funds weren't being used to maintain anything meaningful. There were no community upgrades, no new infrastructure. The park benches still had splinters. The irrigation in the front entrance beds still leaked. Yet every year the HOA dues increased. Every year the fine revenue grew. Where was the money going? We found partial answers in the tax filings. The HOA paid a consulting firm over $40,000 annually. The firm was registered to someone named Darren Denton, Melissa's husband. It was so simple, it made me laugh. They were funneling money through a shell company right under everyone's noses. Consulting services for HOA compliance evaluations, it said. But it was just an invoice mill, a drain, a legal-looking cover for what amounted to theft. I made copies. Meanwhile, Linda started organizing small house gatherings, inviting neighbors over for tea and to share stories of what they'd endured. Some people brought paperwork. Others brought tears. We didn't ask anyone to join anything. We just listened. We gave them the dignity of being heard. And that changed everything. Because when people stop feeling alone in their struggle, they stop being afraid. One night as we sat around Linda's dining table, Gail said, "They think we're just angry. But this isn't about revenge, is it?" "No," I said. "It's about restoring what they stole: trust, peace, the right to breathe on your own land." That week, I was served with a formal summons. Melissa and the HOA board had filed a cease and desist against me, alleging defamation, harassment, and interference with HOA governance. They demanded I take down the bulletin board, stop collecting testimonies, and refrain from provoking dissent. I brought it straight to the county's Housing Affairs Unit. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Kelly Tran, took one look at the filing and shook her head. "They're panicking," she said. "That's not how a legitimate board behaves. They're scared they're losing control," I told her. "You're right," she said. And they are. The cease and desist was dismissed within a day. But the blowback only intensified. Don Walters began walking the neighborhood with a camera recording random properties. Neighbors reported him lurking by mailboxes, scribbling notes, sometimes knocking just to check on things. It was classic intimidation. That weekend, someone poured bleach into my pond. I came out Sunday morning to find the water cloudy, and half the reeds dead, floating in oily ribbons along the edge. The heron didn't return that week. I stood there, fists clenched, the stink of chlorine and decay choking the morning air. It wasn't just vandalism. It was an act of cowardice, a message. But I didn't flinch. I filed a police report, had a water test done, took photographs, logged everything. Then I printed the pictures, blew them up, and posted them on the same board they tried to tear down. I added a new headline. "They're not just threatening us, they're poisoning our land." That night, someone slid another note under my door. "You're making enemies, Callahan. You should know when to quit." But it was too late. I wasn't afraid of enemies. I'd met worse in foreign deserts. I'd walked through firefights and buried men better than anyone on that board. I'd seen what real loss looked like. This was theater. Mean-spirited theater with bad actors and worse writing. The next HOA meeting was packed, not just by the usual handful, but by over 60 residents, standing room only. Melissa tried to control the agenda, but voices rose from every corner of the room. "What did you do with our money? Why are you threatening our neighbors? Where are the audits?" And finally, a man in the back, someone I'd never met before, stood and asked, "Are you proud of who you've become?" Melissa didn't answer. Don tried to adjourn the meeting early, but it was too late. The spell was broken. They couldn't unhear the truth. That night, when I walked back home under the stretch of stars, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I buried Margaret. Hope. And I knew then, without a shadow of doubt, they weren't in control anymore. We were. It was 6:47 a.m. when I walked into the county government center with the full file under my arm. The building was modern, all glass and angles, as if it was trying to prove it belonged in a future it hadn't earned yet. But the people inside, paper souls mostly. Bureaucrats shuffling forms and checking boxes, their hands smelling faintly of toner and cold coffee. I walked past the front desk without hesitating. I knew where I was going. Office 241B, Legal Oversight, Public Associations Division. I had called the week before to confirm the appointment. Kelly Tran had said, "Bring everything you've got." The real kind of everything. And I had. The file was thick and heavy, its weight more moral than physical. It contained 3 months' worth of documentation, HOA bylaws, neighborhood testimonies, financial records, incident reports, and even the water test results from the day someone poured bleach into my pond. I also brought something more personal, a photo of Margaret and me from the year we moved into Cedar Hollow. She was standing by what used to be the rose garden, laughing, holding up a little sign we had carved ourselves, "Our piece of peace." I slipped that photo into the front flap of the file. Because this wasn't just about me or even the pond. This was about reclaiming what had been stolen, not in money, but in dignity. Kelly greeted me with a firm handshake. She was one of those people who wore authority lightly, but effectively black slacks, no-nonsense eyes, and a clipboard that she rarely looked at because everything was already in her head. We sat in a narrow conference room where the ceiling lights buzzed faintly. She laid out a legal pad, clicked her pen, and said, "Okay, Mr. Callahan, let's walk through it." I started with the timeline. I told her how it began with an unannounced knock and a $2,500 fine for a pond that had been fully cleared by county environmental code. I told her how that fine led me to uncover a history of selective enforcement, manipulated votes, and money quietly funneled to a company owned by Melissa Denton's husband. I showed her the tax filings, the faux consulting firm, the edited minutes from board meetings, where votes were unanimous despite 3 members being absent. I showed her the cease and desist letter, the threats, the bleach. I showed her the dozens of letters from neighbors, some handwritten, some typed, detailing how they were fined, shamed, and silenced. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked only one question. Did they ever provide a certified third-party audit of their budget in the last 5 years? No, I said. They voted against it 3 times. She scribbled something on her pad. Then she leaned back, eyes scanning the far wall like she was aligning invisible pieces. Well, she said, tapping her pen, "You've built a compelling case. And if even half of this holds up under review, the HOA is in violation of at least 4 sections of the Koch County Residential Governance Code, possibly more." My breath caught. Will they be investigated? They already are. And based on what you've given us, we're expanding it. She paused, then added, "This may also reach state level. There's a pattern here that mirrors other complaints we've had from different subdivisions. Yours is just clearer, better documented." She thanked me for my time, asked if I'd be willing to testify if needed, and then escorted me out like I was someone who mattered. I hadn't felt that in years. Outside, the morning had softened. The clouds thinned into strips of light, and the smell of sun-warmed pavement filled the air. I stood on the steps for a moment, the file still tucked under my arm, though lighter now, like a burden shared. That afternoon, I got a call from Chuck Wallace, the former board member. "You lit a fire," he said. "Melissa just sent an emergency email calling for a private board meeting. No agenda. Closed session. She's panicking." "Good," I said. "She should be. Word is she's trying to push for damage control, hire a PR firm, maybe even pin the blame on Don." "Let them try," I said. "It won't change the truth." And the truth was coming, slow, methodical, and unstoppable. That week, flyers appeared on mailboxes throughout the neighborhood. Not from me, not from Linda or Ramon or Gail, but from a new group of residents calling themselves the Cedar Hollow Cooperative. The flyer simply read, "We believe in fair governance. We believe in transparency. We believe it's time for change." It listed a meeting date open to all residents independent of the HOA. More than 80 people showed up. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't loud. It was something deeper, the quiet reclaiming of agency. People asked questions, took notes. Some offered to run for the next HOA board elections. Others volunteered to form a finance committee. I just sat in the back and watched. At the end, someone stood and asked, "Where's Callahan?" I raised my hand halfway, a little embarrassed. The room broke into applause. Not cheering, just hands clapping slowly, steadily together. I didn't cry, not there. But I felt something shift in me. A knot inside that had been tightening for years loosened just enough to let me breathe differently, more freely. The next morning, I walked out to the pond. The heron had returned. She stood in the reeds, still and serene, like she'd never left. I sat by the edge, the air humming with frogs and promise. The pond wasn't big. It wasn't deep. But it held more than water now. It held proof that one person can make a difference when they stop being silent, and that when you stand your ground sometimes, just sometimes, the ground remembers. The hearing was held in a modest municipal courtroom downtown. One of those rooms where beige walls meet brown trim, and the air always smells faintly of old paper and unease. It wasn't the kind of setting that invited drama, but everyone in that room that morning could feel it coming. Tension hovered like a second ceiling. I arrived 20 minutes early, wearing my old Marine Corps tie, not to make a point, but because Margaret had given it to me the day I retired. It was simple. Navy blue. A quiet kind of dignity. I sat alone in the third row, file folder in my lap, watching as others trickled in. Melissa came in 10 minutes before the gavel dropped, heels clacking against tile lips pressed into a line that pretended calm. Don followed her like a misplaced security detail holding a thick binder that looked impressive, but probably held nothing but printouts of bylaws he didn't understand. Behind them were 3 HOA board members I barely recognized, people who had signed their names onto dozens of decisions they never questioned. Across the aisle sat Ryan Dorsey, Kelly Tran, and a small team of auditors and legal counsel from the county. Their faces were unreadable, and that's how I knew they meant business. The hearing wasn't a trial. Not yet. It was what the county called a compliance review session, a formal gathering to determine whether the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association had violated its charter and if legal enforcement was necessary. But from the moment it started, it was clear this wasn't just routine. Kelly opened with a brief summary of the investigation's scope. "We are here today to evaluate the governance practices of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association following multiple complaints from residents regarding financial mismanagement, abuse of authority, and violations of county code." She didn't look at Melissa when she said it. She looked at me. Melissa stood when it was her turn. Her voice was smooth, controlled the same cadence I remembered from the HOA meetings. We have always acted in the best interest of our community. Any allegations suggesting misconduct are misguided and stem from a small group of residents with personal grievances. It was a performance, neat polished, but brittle. Then the evidence began. Ryan Dorsey presented the fine schedules first, spreadsheets showing a pattern of enforcement that disproportionately targeted certain households, repeated fines issued for non-existent infractions, and inconsistencies between violation letters and HOA policies. Then came the financial records, the payments to Darren Denton's consulting firm, the absence of third-party audits, the irregularities in expense reports. Each document was projected onto a screen behind the panel. With every new page, the room seemed to tighten. Melissa's face remained fixed, but her hands started to fidget. Dawn's posture sagged by the minute. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I stood at the podium, unfolded my notes, and began with a story. I moved to Cedar Hollow with my wife Margaret 12 years ago. We bought a little corner of peace, a place to retire, garden, and breathe after decades of service. Last year, I built a small pond to irrigate my trees and to heal. My wife had passed, and I needed something living to care for. I followed every law, filed every permit. I held up the fine notice they'd issued me. This, I said, was the thanks I got. A total of $500. No explanation, no due process, just punishment. I let that settle before continuing. But it wasn't just about me. Over the last few months, I've spoken with dozens of my neighbors, people who were fined for growing vegetables, for painting a fence, for installing a flagpole. People who were threatened with liens, who paid thousands in fear. And while we were told these rules were for our shared good, the money disappeared into consulting fees and unverified expenses. Our rights were used as bargaining chips in someone else's pocketbook. I paused and looked Melissa in the eye. That's not leadership. That's exploitation. When I stepped down, the room was silent. Then came the testimonies. One by one, neighbors stood and shared their stories. Linda, who had paid hundreds for her planter boxes. Gail, who was warned about her solar panels. Ramon, whose young daughter cried when the HOA agent yelled at him from the street. It wasn't dramatic, it was honest. Quiet, truthful pain laid bare. The panel asked questions about how board decisions were made, whether any votes were documented, if resident complaints were ever formally addressed. Melissa tried to pivot, to deflect, to suggest that we were a vocal minority stirring unrest. But the more she spoke, the more her credibility cracked. She couldn't explain the missing audits, couldn't justify the shell company, couldn't account for why nearly half the community had paid fines in the last 2 years while no improvements had been made to shared spaces. Near the end, Kelly looked up from her notes and asked a final question. Can you provide us with a complete certified audit of HOA finances from the past 3 fiscal years? Melissa's lips parted, then closed. No, she admitted. The gavel came down not as a verdict, but as a pause. We will issue a ruling within 15 business days, Kelly said. But based on the evidence presented today, corrective measures are likely forthcoming. People began to rise, murmuring, filing out. But they weren't quiet with resignation. They were quiet with something else, anticipation. I walked outside into sunlight. For a moment, I stood there on the courthouse steps, the sound of car doors and traffic echoing in the distance. Gail joined me, her face still flushed. You think it'll stick? She asked. They can't unsee what they saw today. She smiled. I've lived here 15 years. I've never felt this proud of this neighborhood. That night, someone left a small wooden sign at the edge of my pond. It had been carved by hand. I recognized the lettering. Margaret's style. I picked it up and read. Still water runs deep, so do roots. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name to know who it came from. 12 days later, the envelope arrived. I had just finished mending a section of the fence that bordered my west pasture. Nothing serious, just a weathered board that needed some attention when I saw the official seal on the thick manila envelope wedged in my mailbox. County letterhead, Legal Affairs Division. I carried it inside without opening it right away. It felt almost sacred, the weight of it. I made coffee first, as if somehow the warmth might steady me. Then I sat at the kitchen table, laid the envelope down beside my mug, and took a deep breath before slicing it open. There were 3 pages. The first bore the heading, Administrative Enforcement Action, Cedar Hollow, HOA County of Millbrook. The summary was direct. Following the compliance review hearing and pursuant to County Residential Governance Code Section 22.4b. It is the decision of the Oversight Panel that the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association has acted in sustained violation of its charter and applicable county statutes. I kept reading. Effective immediately, the Cedar Hollow HOA shall be stripped of its authority to collect fines or fees beyond standard dues pending a full third-party audit. Furthermore, any and all fines collected under unauthorized policy revisions since January 1, 2019, shall be refunded in full to all affected residents within 90 days. I sat there blinking. It didn't feel real at first. The kind of outcome you dare to imagine, but never expect to see written in ink. But there it was, a ruling, a reckoning. They weren't just suspending the HOA's powers, they were forcing them to pay it all back. $142,000. Refunded. To the very people they had bullied, manipulated, and drained dry over the years. I flipped to the second page and scanned for my name, and there it was. Case origin James Callahan filed April 4th. They even included a commendation and acknowledgement of my role in compiling exceptionally thorough documentation that aided in the investigation. I chuckled softly. Margaret would have teased me for keeping all those files in such neat alphabetical order. But it wasn't the commendation that brought the lump to my throat. It was the third page, an attached form titled Resident Restitution Statement. At the bottom, in clean black print, was the figure. Refund amount due to you, total $500. I set the paper down and stared at the window where the wind played gently with the willow branches by the pond. The frogs were already beginning their evening chorus. The light slanted across the water like something sacred. I didn't feel victorious. I felt balanced. Whole. But that was only the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood buzzed like it never had before. The county posted a public notice on their website confirming the ruling and outlining the steps for residents to claim refunds. People who had once felt alone now walked taller, nodded more often, stopped to talk by the curb. Even the kids seemed to play louder, freer, like the air had lost some invisible weight. The real fallout, however, began with the board. Melissa Denton resigned 2 days after the ruling. She sent a terse email to all residents claiming she was stepping down to focus on family and wellness. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a retreat, quiet and strategic. Don Walters was less lucky. The county filed a formal inquiry into misuse of authority and alleged tampering with resident communications. I didn't know if it would lead to anything criminal, but his days as compliance officer were over. His clipboard, which once felt like a symbol of authority, now lay forgotten in the HOA's locked office, its doors plastered with a county-issued notice of suspension. And the Denton consulting firm dissolved within a week. Its shell registration revoked, its website scrubbed clean. But more powerful than the resignations, the fines, or the bureaucratic fallout was what happened between neighbors. Gail started a resident-run newsletter. It was printed on recycled paper and delivered by hand every Sunday, full of updates, gardening tips, and neighbor spotlights. Linda began hosting monthly community lunches in her backyard. Ramon set up a tool-sharing station in front of his garage. Even Chuck, the former board member, began drawing up plans to run for a transparent, community-elected committee, not to enforce rules, but to advocate for improvements that actually mattered. As for me, I stayed quiet in the background. I wasn't looking for recognition. I just wanted peace. The kind that doesn't have to be defended with paperwork. One afternoon, as I sat by the pond with a glass of iced tea and my boots resting on the old oak stump, a young woman approached. She introduced herself as Marcy. I recognized her from the East End, single mom, 2 boys. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice soft but steady. That refund. It covered my oldest son's hearing aid. I didn't know what to say. So I just nodded, feeling something break open gently in my chest. It wasn't just about money, she added. You reminded people they mattered. We stopped being afraid. Later that evening, a group of neighborhood kids came to my door with a handmade sign. Crayons, glitter glue, crooked letters that read, "Thank you, Mr. C." I pinned it to the inside of my shed. That night, I walked the edge of the pond as the last of the light faded. The water shimmered peaceful and unbothered. The heron was there again, standing sentinel, as if to say, I told you this would be worth it. I stood still for a long time listening. To frogs. To wind. To the sound of a neighborhood exhaling after years of being held hostage by fear. Not every battle needs a courtroom. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to say, enough. And this time, that someone had been me. The strange thing about power is that when it collapses, it doesn't fall like a tower in a single crash. It frays, unravels, slips out of the hands that once gripped it tightly until there's nothing left but the memory of control. And that's exactly what happened in Cedar Hollow after the ruling landed. By the first week of August, HOA operations had all but frozen. The office, once patrolled by Don Walters like a fortress, remained locked with the county's suspension notice still fluttering in the summer wind. The phones rang unanswered. The HOA email auto-replied with a vague, "We are currently undergoing administrative review and cannot respond at this time." The silence was deafening. What replaced their absence wasn't chaos, it was community. For the first time in years, people started organizing without fear. And I don't mean another board. I mean people neighbors taking ownership of their spaces. Not because a rule demanded it, but because care demanded it. Chuck and a few volunteers cleaned the weeds out of the neighborhood park that the HOA had neglected for months. Gail's husband repaired 2 of the broken benches. Linda, bless her spirit, took it upon herself to repaint the little free library box near the corner of Bramble and Oak. It had been tagged once and ignored by the HOA for over a year. Now it gleamed cherry red, stocked full of books, including some children's classics I hadn't seen since the 60s. At night, I'd sit by the pond and listen to voices drifting on the air. Not the cold, clipped tones of rule enforcers or the heavy silence of people too scared to speak, but laughter guitar strums. The soft shouts of kids playing past dusk. Something had changed. And not just procedurally, spiritually. Melissa disappeared completely. Her house, a prim beige 2-story, that used to intimidate with its manicured hedges and HOA-approved shutters, now stood quiet. No cars in the driveway. No lights in the windows after dark. Rumor had it she and Darren had relocated to her sister's place 2 counties over. Some said she was consulting a lawyer. Others said she was just humiliated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. I had never wanted revenge. Just a return to sanity. But not everyone was ready to forgive. Some neighbors pushed for criminal charges. A petition went around demanding that the county press fraud charges against the Dentons for misuse of funds. I didn't sign it. Not because I didn't think they deserved accountability, but because I believed in letting the system finish what it had begun. In mid-August, I got another letter, this one from the Office of Civil Remedies. A formal notice that a class action restitution suit was being opened for residents who had suffered material damages due to unlawful HOA practices. My name was listed among the primary witnesses. I spent 2 hours on the phone with the county attorney's office that week. They asked questions about dates, about tone, about Melissa's exact words in board meetings. I answered everything calmly, methodically. It wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about facts. And the facts were on our side. 2 days later, a reporter from the Millbrook Times showed up at my door. She was young, early 20s maybe, with a press badge that hung too large around her neck. Her name was Sienna. Said she'd heard about the hearing and the refunds and wanted to do a piece for the Sunday edition. I just want to know what it felt like, she asked, holding up her recorder to go from being fined to being the one who made the system answer for it. I stared at her a moment. You ever been in a war zone, Sienna? Her smile faded slightly. No. Well, I said, when the bombs stop falling, it's quiet. Too quiet. You start hearing birds again, and it messes with your head. That's what this feels like. Strange peace. Earned, but still unbelievable. She quoted that line in the article, printed it under the title, "One Pond, One Man. One Neighborhood's Reckoning." It was a good piece, respectful, balanced. The article went viral in the local community forums. Within a week, 3 other neighborhoods reached out asking for advice on how to audit their own HOAs. I started getting emails from people I didn't know, names from other counties, even other states. How did you start the process? What's the first thing we should check in our bylaws? Is it true you were a Marine? I answered every one of them. Because if Cedar Hollow could fall into the grip of abuse, so could anywhere else. And if one man with a pond and a folder could expose it, so could anyone. The final HOA board election was scheduled for the end of September. There were 9 candidates, all new. All neighbors I trusted. Chuck was one of them. Gail, too. They weren't looking to recreate what we had. They were trying to rebuild it into something honest, something small, something that stayed out of people's gardens and let folks live. On the night of the election, we gathered in the clubhouse, the same place where Melissa had once spoken over everyone like a queen addressing her subjects. But this time the room buzzed with equality, with voices, with promise. Votes were counted by hand, announcements made with handshakes, not speeches. Afterward, as the crowd began to thin and people made their way home under the warm glow of porch lights, Chuck found me standing by the old flagpole. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "We couldn't have done this without you," he said. I shook my head. "You could have. I just reminded you that you could." He smiled. "Still, you were the one who stood up first." I didn't have a response, but I didn't need one. The moment said everything. As I walked home, I passed a few kids playing in a sprinkler, their laughter sharp and clear against the night air. I passed Linda's house, her new ramp, shining in the moonlight, untouched, unchallenged. And then I turned into my own drive where the pond lay still as glass under the stars. It had started with that water, with a hole in the ground filled not just with runoff and rain, but with purpose, with memory, with defiance. They had tried to make me feel small, but in defending that pond, I'd discovered something far bigger. The first cool breeze of October rolled in like an exhale. I woke early that morning before the sun had even touched the tops of the pine trees and stepped out onto the porch with my coffee steaming in my hands. The air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke fall settling into the bones of the land. And my pond was still there. It sat in its gentle hollow, cradled between clusters of goldenrod and the fading greens of late-season grass. Mist rose from its surface in soft tendrils curling into the dawn like breath. The water was calm, reflecting the early sky with a clarity that only comes after storms. It had been 8 months since Melissa knocked on my door with that fine in her hand. 8 months since a quiet man with no intention of fighting found himself in the middle of a neighborhood revolution. Now there was no HOA car crawling past my house. No clipboard shadows watching from behind trimmed hedges. No threat letters in the mailbox. No silent stares at community meetings. Instead, there were garden beds, blooming with vegetables, solar panels gleaming proudly from rooftops, porches painted in whatever color the owners damn well pleased. There were neighbors who waved longer, people who stopped to talk about more than just the weather. And there were signs of change that you couldn't see on paper, only feel like peace in the muscle memory of a place. A few days earlier, Chuck had stopped by to bring me a copy of the new community charter. Just 6 pages. Clear, precise, and democratic. It limited the board's authority, prohibited arbitrary fines, and required full financial transparency with yearly third-party audits. He'd left it with a note that read, "We finally built something honest." I'd left the note on my kitchen table. Margaret would have liked it. She always believed in quiet revolutions. Later that day, I decided to do something I'd put off for months. I dug out the old bench she and I had bought from a roadside flea market a decade ago, the one with iron legs and peeling cedar slats. It had been sitting in the shed since the day she passed. I repaired it slowly, sanded it, stained it, bolted the legs back in place. Then I carried it down to the pond, placed it under the willow tree, and sat. The heron was there again. It had returned more often now. I took that as a sign not from nature, but from life itself. That when things are in balance, the world finds its way back to you. Behind me, I heard soft footsteps crunching the leaves. I turned to see Linda approaching, carrying a folded lawn chair under one arm and a mason jar of lemonade in the other. "Mind some company?" she asked. "Not at all." She set the chair beside the bench and sat. For a while, we didn't talk, just watched the water. "Feels different now," she finally said. "It is." She nodded. "You know, I used to avoid walking down this path. Afraid they'd say something, find me for the wildflowers. Now they're the prettiest part," I said. She smiled. "Funny how much fear we let in just to keep the peace." "It wasn't peace," I said. "It was silence. Peace is what we have now." A breeze rustled the trees, shaking loose a flurry of amber leaves that drifted down like a soft applause. Eventually, Linda stood. "We're doing a potluck next week, down at the park. You should come. Bring that cornbread you make." "I'll be there." She gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading back up the path, her chair swinging lightly by her side. As I watched her go, I felt something shift again, not like a burden lifting, but like a foundation settling. I'd built a lot of things in my life: forts, relationships, a home. But none had meant more to me than what I helped build here. Not because it was loud, but because it lasted. I glanced over to the edge of the pond where a group of kids were setting up paper boats. They laughed as one of them shoved his craft too hard, sending it nose first into the mud. His older sister laughed, retrieved it, and set it straight. Their joy was unguarded. No fear of citations, no adult watching from the shadows with a measuring tape and a rule book. Just children, on land that finally felt like theirs again. The pond didn't sparkle. It wasn't fancy. But it had become a symbol of resistance, of truth, of stillness that refused to be paved over by petty power. In its silence, it had made more noise than any protest ever could. A reflection not just of trees and sky, but of what a neighborhood should be: unmanipulated, unafraid, and fully alive. As the sun rose higher, I stood and stretched, then turned toward the house. The frogs croaked softly behind me, the heron shifting its weight in the reeds. I smiled, because the fight was over, and the pond was still here, and so was I.